Good morning, welcome. No, you have to press the button. There you go.
Thank you. Thank you for giving leave for us to speak to the Council motion concerning emissions and waste from cruise ships. I'm Mark Gardner, President of the James Bay Neighbourhood Association and lead on the emissions file since 2006, when JBNA approached VHA to study emissions from the dark plumes which were over our community. Also speaking today is Bob Vandersteen, who joined the JBNA Quality of Life Committee in 2011, and as a seasoned industry engineer, soon became a key member of the air quality group working with the UVic scientists studying air quality. We will touch upon various aspects of the cruise industry emissions and waste, which are the subject of the motion, requesting staff to look at the authority of the city regarding control of the use of Victoria as a port of call. Our review was done in light of the ambitious and bold climate leadership plan, which was presented to you by staff on November 14th.
The dramatic and unbridled growth of the industry has left the city in a catch-up position with respect to environmental and quality of life impacts. Both the number of visits and the size of ships have increased. This year, or rather next year, there is a forecast 8% increase in passenger counts. This year, the increase was 21%. Over the last 5 years, we've seen a 50% increase, and over the last 15 years, 160%. In 2006, ships arrived only between Thursday and Saturday evenings. Expansion of the industry has meant that ships now arrive on every day of the week. With the weekend berth slots being saturated, weekday visits are now increasing. The average passenger time in port has stabilized at around 6.7 hours. In 2020, ships will visit Victoria for 139 days, leaving the community with few cruise ship-free days during the late spring and summer.
This is not a surprise, as the industry has been forthright about expansion. In 2012, GVHA commissioned industry reports. This and the following slide are from the Bermelo, Jamil, and Partners study. You can see on this slide the purple line. It's very important. That one is the one we're actually at. The Alaska growth since 2012 has followed that line. The 3-year dip was a reflection of the 2008 recession. The intention was and remains unbridled growth. Recently, Mayor Help spoke of clouds of black smoke billowing over the legislature. We hope to bring some rationale to that comment. As an energy source, almost all ships burn bunker fuel, using scrubbers to eliminate sulfur dioxide, SO2. After removal of sulfur compounds, emissions are greenhouse gases, particulate matter, and small amounts of volatile organic compounds. In addition to black clouds, residents have commented on orange and brown plumes. We are seeing what we're seeing, and what Mayor Helps was actually referring to was nitrous oxides and particulate matter in water vapor. You've all heard of NOx, COx, and SOx, which is what we're looking at. Information from the 2006 and 2009 CalPUF air quality analysis is useful today. The schematic on the left is a 24-hour sulfur dioxide dispersion schematic based on sampling in the field. The graph to the right provided conclusive evidence of the impact of cruise ships in the region. The light green curve peak shows sulfur dioxide at the CRD Topaz monitoring site during the 2006 cruise season. Ships created more SO2 than all the vehicles in the Topaz area. In 2006, there were 185 ships, smaller ships, with mainly the Thursday to Saturday visits. Yet, the CalPUF study team had modeled acceptable levels of SO2. The mammal schematic at the bottom of the slide shows the severity of the SO2 during the 89 actual day measurement period when a mobile laboratory was quietly placed beside McDonald Park in James Bay. On a daily maximum SO2 level, SO2 was higher in James Bay than in Trail, BC. Why did the study suggest a third of the measured level? The answer? The modeling was based on industry-asserted sulfur levels in the fuel of 1.6 sulfur. whereas it was tripled when it was actually measured, and the tripling kind of reflected perhaps what bunker fuel had, which is between 4 and 4.5% sulfur in fuel. The subsequent VHA health assessment stated possible premature deaths. To its shame, the city said nothing at the time. The sulfur dioxide problem has been resolved. It is not a problem. In 2011, after the Ministry of Environment placed that monitor in James Bay, SO2 emissions were halved. As ECA, the North American Emissions Control Agreement, came into effect, SO2 levels lowered further and are no longer a problem. There was an anomaly in 2014 when the highest level recorded occurred on May 9th. At an open GVHA board meeting a week later, Greg Wirtz, then president of CLIA, which is the lobby group for the cruise industry, recognized the high SO2 event, stating that the octane bursts were uniquely adjacent to residences and that CLIA had advised against 4 ships in one day. Residents are aware of the plume and are taking to social media to tell their stories. Of course, with social media, we don't know whether a person is actually a resident of the city or a visitor or lives in a nearby municipality. I don't know the person who, for example, who tweeted these slides. The CalPUF modeling in 2008 did more than examine sulfur dioxide. It also assessed the dispersion of particulate matter, both larger 10 micron and the fine particulates 2.5 and less. Although there are many more ships now and the stacks of the current fleet of ships are higher, new studies really aren't needed. I don't want us to get distracted in needing studies, as the schematics at that time period can be used as proxies. Fine particulates are of concern, as the use of scrubbers is known to reduce large particulates while increasing fine particulate matter. Although large particulate matter is more visible, creating soot-like dust, and you get more complaints with it, the fine particulates are more of a health concern, as they more directly and easily enter your lungs. One of the documents submitted in support of this presentation provided a link to a report on an undercover measure of particulates on 4 Carnival ships. I would hope that you look at the attachments we presented. The dispersion schematics for the nitrous oxide speaks more directly to Mayor Help's comment about dark plumes. That's what these slides are, and they show the dispersion of the orange-brown plumes. As the emission, with a bit of particulate in it, and they probably get darker because of that. As the emissions control agreement came into effect, the scientists from UVics cautioned us that although the sulfur dioxide would be resolved, nitrous oxides and other compounds would be emitted, and people with chemical sensitivities would continue to experience problems, and that's what we're experiencing now. Except for those with whose health is compromised, the emissions would create a more minor quality of life issue than those who actually have health issues. Please remember, James Bay, 40% of residents are over 65 years of age, or 60, can't remember which.
Alaska, unlike Victoria, monitors ship emissions. In 2018, 10 ships which visited both Alaska and Victoria received air and water violation notices. These same 10 ships accounted for over 40% of the total cruise ship visits to Victoria in that year. The City of Victoria has documented its greenhouse gas reduction targets, both long-term and on a yearly basis. From 2020 until 2030, the City has projected a yearly 6% reduction target in greenhouse gases. From the GVHA emission report, we see that greenhouse gas emissions have increased at 7% a year since 2010 and currently account for 3.3% of the city's annual greenhouse gas emissions during the 6-month cruise ship season. With the city reducing greenhouse gases by 6% a year, and the cruise ship emissions increasing by 7% a year, the cruise ship emissions will account for 7% of the city's total by 2025. The recent Synergy Emissions Inventory Report was well publicised by GVHA, the press and television. But not once was it mentioned that no, repeat no, cruise ship emission measurements were actually taken at Ogden Point. This should have been clearly stated within the report's executive summary, not solely contained within a lengthy paragraph on page 11. The data within the report is entirely theoretical and assumes the use of low sulphur fuel. Cruise ships with scrubbers burn high sulphur fuel, as well as no mechanical failures, and also that the cruise companies behave in an environmentally ethical manner. The scrubbers are required and have proved their capability to reduce sulphur dioxide emissions to the level that would be achieved if the ships were burning low sulphur fuel. The same equivalency is not required for particulate matter. The ships burn high sulphur fuel in port, but the report has assumed low sulphur fuel when calculating particulate matter emissions. As reported in a well-publicised undercover report, ultrafine particles, which can be very hazardous to health, were found to be at extremely high levels on cruise ship decks.
The words shore power or cold ironing have been dangled as a cure-all. Talk and studies followed a few years later with more talk and studies, while other mitigation or control measures have not been implemented. They've been dismissed. Yet shore power may not itself be the solution to emissions from cruise ships which are burning bunker fuel or other petroleum products. In Vancouver, which has shore power, the use of the facility has been limited and declining. In 2018, only 26% of visits connected, while 37% of ships were capable. In 2015, 84% of ships capable of using shore power connected, while in 2018, only 70% of the ships capable of using shore power connected. There are necessary conditions for shore power to be the emission solutions for GVHA and for residents. Previous proposals involved in GVHA studies involved an arm at the North Pier which could be used to service ships on either side of the pier. This suggests that benefits would be achieved with a limit of 2 ships in port at the same time. Also, staggering arrivals and departures would facilitate hookups. Although this slide and previous GVHA studies suggest that shore power should be used only for long stays, technological advancements have shortened the time period. Newer ships could use shore power with a short, even 4.5-hour visit. Regarding the BC Hydro grid, in addition to accessing the grid, a battery bank in one of the large buildings by the piers could be charged during the off-peak late-night hours and serve as reserve for peak hour visits. Mayor Helps has suggested that any shore power should not be financed by the taxpayer. We agree. This multi-billion-dollar industry has already received taxpayer subsidy through government grants over the past several years. We understand that the shore power used by the cable ship, the Innovator, which tries to park at Ogden, was installed and paid for by the cable ship company itself. Suggestions that the industry will reduce the rate of carbon emissions are worrisome if the number of ships in expansion means less or no net reduction in emissions. Many players are involved in air quality. GVHA's landlord is responsible with its tenants for pollution created by the tenants. The city for land use zoning and bylaws and for local activities, including use of our streets. The government of BC and federal government are also responsible for air shared matters, while Transport Canada is responsible for the behaviour and compliance of ships while they are in federal Canadian waters. This schematic is from the Ogden Point Master Plan document. The red dashed line represents the property line boundary. The Ogden water lot is within the city boundary. It is owned by GVHA. The blue rectangular water lot to the north belongs to Transport Canada and until recently was used by Mercury Marine. The landlord's liability document is provided as a support document to this presentation. When cruise ships enter the public port of Victoria, they are in federal waters. But once they maneuver and enter the Ogden Point water lots, They leave federal waters and enter GVHA property and are within the City of Victoria boundary. Ogden Point is zoned M2 light industrial. There is a performance zoning clause which prohibits activities which are noxious or offenses to the immediate neighbourhood, to those who live on the west side of James Bay near Ogden Point. Note also that a waste sorting and distribution centre is not identified as a permitted use. GVHA owns fee simple Ogden Point land and water lots. As landlord, they share the liability and responsibility for the pollution, and which they refer to as hoteling cruise ships. As a landlord hosting porting activity, is also GVHA's responsibility to know what pollution is being created by their tenants. We have asked for and not received anything from GVHA that they would actually even measure particulate matter. If someone can do an undercover investigation on a ship with handheld equipment, it can be done at GVHA. Contract law trumps regulatory law. GVHA is a contractor. They could alter the behavior of the industry. A new pier nearing completion in Seattle will support the expansion of this industry and the increasing need for a port of call for a stop in Victoria, as going up to ports on the east side of the island would create a real time expense for the industry. The city is responsible for zoning of lands and water lots within the boundaries. It is also responsible for ensuring compliance with respect to zoning. Victoria's official community plan also recognizes the need to consider public health and ecological implications, including air quality and noise. The James Bay Neighbourhood Plan identifies the importance of the industries, whether new or established, to be compatible with the neighbourhood.
For many years, JBNA has been assessing the ground transportation impacts created by cruise activity on the community using data collected by the city. Residents have identified year after year congestion, noise and safety issues associated with buses and taxis. Working with city staff, monitoring sites were selected each year. The map here shows the data collection sites for 2019. In May this year, the city set up traffic monitors at 5 James Bay locations. We were provided with the data, and by correlating this data with ship times, we were able to compare traffic volumes and speeds for both ship in port and no ship days. This chart shows the traffic volumes on Dallas Road for no ship, 1 ship, 2 ship, and 3 ship days. The highest vehicle count on a no ship day is about 150 per hour, and on a 3 ship day, about 420 vehicles per hour. There have been numerous complaints about speeding taxis, primarily from residents on Montreal and Oswego streets. This is a problem that appears to be recognised by GVHA. This chart clearly shows the high number of vehicles per hour exceeding 50 kilometres per hour when cruise ships are in port on Oswego, a residential street. Of particular concern are the 3-ship Friday and Saturday evenings, when up to 40 vehicles an hour exceeded the speed limit. JBNA has been consistent over the past 12 years in seeking changes which will provide mitigation to reduce traffic surges when 2 or 3 ships arrive or depart in the same hour. These traffic surges lead to nearly empty buses and taxis scurrying to and from downtown through our community in an attempt to maximise the number of trips to and from Ogden Point. The city could bring order and calm the traffic. Pedicabs and horse carriages are limited in range and number of licences. Why not buses? Walking should be actively encouraged. GVHA has access control to Ogden Point and could, through contracts, alter cruise schedules and better control ground transportation providers. GPS technology to monitor vehicles' speed is available and should be mandatory on taxis accessing Ogden Point. The data should be visible to allow licenses to be withdrawn if necessary. Jurisdictions elsewhere in the world are making changes. They are bringing the industry under control in an effort to improve the environmental and quality of life for their residents and businesses. Cities are levying passenger taxis to compensate for the costs borne by the city through the use of streets and other public amenities. I've gone too far. 1 second, I'll just see if I'm missing a slide. Aha! Although we have not checked into which other North American ports have shore power, on Tuesday we received the tweets from Integrity BC. They state that California is about to raise the percentage of ships that must use shore power from 70 to 80%.
The leasing of what used to be public lands for waste management purposes to serve the multi-billion-dollar cruise industry has been a great disappointment. Beyond the burden of being placed on the James Bay community, which has restricted road access in and out of our community, the mere idea of Victoria, of Canada, accepting tons of waste to be sorted and disposed of for other countries is abhorrent. We have also heard of barges being used, but not seen any. If barging is to be done, it should be done from Ogden Point. Taking 1,000 tons of recycling per month via truck through James Bay streets is not a solution. It will cost us all, either through direct traffic or other impact thrusts upon James Bay, or through our GHG reduction needs. Simply put, this is wrong and insulting to our community. The City and CRD are rightly targeting reductions, not only for their activities, but for residents and businesses. To ask us to reduce while accepting waste from floating resorts, which may create more waste than our own community, is ludicrous. It belies the principles purported by Mayor and Council and rightly expressed in the recently introduced Climate Leadership Plan. As an aside, please note the photo. Some ships provide mobility scooters for those who are mobility challenged. The cruise industry gains tremendous value by using Victoria as a port of call. Although the head office of most of the cruise lines using Victoria as a port of call are in Seattle or Miami, the ships are not made in the States and hence subject to fines under the U.S. Passenger Vessels Services Act if they do not stop in a foreign port on the Alaska run. The base value of Victoria to the industry is $750 million. It's a lot bigger than your operating budget. Added to this benefit is revenue from shore excursions and tax dollar subsidy through infrastructure grants to GVHA for the dolphins and other facility improvements. And now the convenience of using Victoria, James Bay, as their waste grounds. As part of this presentation, we provided a two-page document which links to articles and studies which speak to the environmental integrity of the cruise industry. We ask that you read each of the documents that have been linked in that paper. The City is embarking on a challenging, forward-looking initiative, the Climate Leadership Plan. The impacts we have discussed, emissions, transportation, and waste, are but the beginning. As the Climate Leadership Plan explains, going forward with embodied emissions, Victoria will need to consider the GHG while ships are traveling along the Strait of Juan de Fuca, the grey water, the other impacts relating to the environment and wildlife. Mayor Helps asked, what is the story we are telling about our city? The City cannot reasonably ask or expect residents or businesses to commit to the ambitious targets of net zero carbon while inviting floating resorts into the city unless that industry meets the same targets. Does this city actually expect 6,000 residents who receive direct emissions to stay indoors with their windows closed in the summer months? Perhaps that's a new meaning of greenhouse gases, gas effect, for the ones who have south windows. About 8 years ago, a ship came into port using LNG. It was clean in that the plume was clear, suggesting no SOx or NOx were present and little particulate matter, because it was a very clean movement. You could see it. The industry is building more LNGs, but only half the new ships being built are LNG. What we have seen over the past couple of years is other cities have led the way. is that the industry will adopt, if it must. The industry is not leading. The City of Victoria cannot be leading unless it tackles this problem. The city needs to be bold. James Bay residents welcome tourists. We share our community. Until recently, we had more bed space in James Bay than downtown. We welcome tourists. To gain social license, the cruise industry needs to change. It needs to respect the communities it visits and to become good corporate citizens in our city. My final words are those of Jennifer Wyland, who presented the city's sustainable mobility strategy with Fraser Work on November 14th. She said, switch the slide. Thank you. You get to set the rules. You get to tell the folks how you want them to innovate, how you want them to operate in your city and your region. You also have the most valuable assets to control. You have the right of way. You have the lands. You have the ability to shape what the city looks like. We also believe that the city has many ways and can create many ways to control this industry, because this industry has proven that it will not do so on its own. It will only do so if pushed, and we need to push beyond regulation. There are many other ways. We welcome any questions you may have, but understand from what Mayor Helps said that you may want to wait until the next presentation, and then we will return, or do you want the questions now?
What I'd like to hear is both presentations, and then we'll invite two people from each presentation to be at the table together, and we'll ask questions of all of you at the same time.
Thank you very much for hearing us today.
Thank you very much. The next presentation is from the Greater Victoria Harbour Authority. Good morning. Welcome.
Good morning, Mayor Helps. Council, thank you for the opportunity for us to come and present our information. Before I begin, and I'll make sure I've just slide up. Have you got the? Oh, there we go. Thank you. Thank you very much. Before I begin, I'd like to also acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories of the Songhees Nation, the Esquimalt Nation, and we are proud as an organization to steward the properties that they're a traditional homeland. We're also very proud that both of these nations are on our board, and we welcome their input and their engagement. Today, what we'd like to cover off is, first of all, some introductions. We'd like to talk about the current and future status of cruise in Victoria, give you a sense of where a cruise is going over the next 5 years. Talk about shore power. I'm also going to ask Jill to have more detailed conversation around the emissions inventory and the findings. We're also going to talk about waste management, and then finally global cruise efforts and then next steps. This is in response to the motion that was approved by Mayor and Council about 6 weeks ago, asking us as an organization to come in and address issues around emissions and also around waste management. In terms of introductions, my name is Ian Robertson. I'm the CEO of the Greater Victoria Harbour Authority. Also joining us is Jill Doucette, who's the CEO and founder of Synergy Enterprises, Steve Hanako, who is the Vice President and General Manager of TIMAC, and Barry Penner, who is a Strategic Advisor to CLIA Northwest in Canada. So a little bit about the organization from a financial point of view. This is just our fiscal year just ending. We're not a large organization. We generate just over $15 million in operating revenue, $12 million in expenses. EBITDA is simply said our surplus. And as you will know, all of our monies are reinvested back into the properties that we are responsible for maintaining. This year we are forecasting to spend just over or just around $9 million in capital, and most of that, $6 million of that, is towards the improvements, enhancements we are making to the terminal in the installation of a mooring dolphin. In terms of just a quick recap on 2019 and a look ahead to 2020, we are going to see an increase in passenger count in 2020, and a number of different vessels arriving about the same, and the number of cruise lines visiting is down just very slightly. As we look ahead, though, over the next 5 years, looking back to 2018, I've noted 2020 there. 2021, we're going to begin to see a bit of a flattening or a leveling off of the cruise line passenger count. That's because we're seeing a bit of a bump in 2020 with new ships new arriving, and then also in 2022 we forecast around 785,000 passengers. So what we've experienced over the last 5 years is a significant growth in the Alaska market, and very, very popular, but we're starting to see a bit of a leveling off in terms of what we forecast on the horizon. In terms of looking at shore power, a little bit of a background here in the sort of top left-hand corner. The organization, the Harbour Authority, commissioned a report in 2012 that estimated that the installation of shore power would be around $14 million. Yes, shore power was installed at Pier A to satisfy the cable innovator, the cable repair ship that is there and is moored there most of the year. And then in 2019, we wanted to get a bit of a sense of the actual emissions happening at Ogden Point in order to begin to build a business case to look at ways in which we could begin to reduce the emissions at Ogden Point. So we commissioned Synergy Enterprises to begin that report in January, and that report finished in August 19, which resulted in a recommendation to our board in September of 2019 to investigate the use of shore power. We are working through the process now to look at the business case for shore power. We have commissioned a consultant to look at that, an engineering consultant, and we expect that report to be finalized by late spring, early summer, and then we will be moving ahead with that recommendation. If I can turn to the emissions inventory at Ogden Point, the triple bottom line approach is very important to our organization. Yes, we talk about the economic benefit that cruise brings to Victoria. It's estimated to be, in a 2016 survey, to be around $130 million a year, but we also wanted to look at what is the social and also the environmental impact. We have been working and looking at ways in which we can continue to improve, and I will talk about quickly two areas. In 2015, the average age of the buses, the engine age of the buses, was averaged around 1986. And in 2010, the average age of the buses was 2010. So significant improvement in terms of engine age. Also in 2015, the number of buses operating off the terminal were 80. And in 2019, the number of licensed buses reduced to 40. So we've reduced the number of buses operating off the terminal by half. We've been able to maintain or to continue to, welcome an increased growth in passengers by the use of double-decker buses, so being more effective and efficient with the number of buses coming off the terminal. The other thing we've done is, contrary to what was earlier reported, we have made great efforts in increasing the number of people who walk off the terminal. Again, in 2015-16, the average number of people walking off the terminal was 23%. And in 2019, happy to report that number grew significantly to 30%. So great steps have been taken. And also, as I mentioned, we wanted to get a baseline of emissions at Ogden Point in order to move towards a business case so we could address GHG and criteria air contaminant and work towards mitigating that impact. Thus, the hiring of Synergy Enterprises in the spring and summer of 2019. I'm going to turn this over to Jill to talk about the results. And I will just say that while we've seen some good improvement, I will be the first one to say that there is much more work that can be done. So Jill, I'll just turn this over to you.
Great. Thank you so much for Mayor and Council for accepting our presentation. I don't think one of our carbon footprint reports has ever been on a big screen in a council chamber, so that's exciting for us to have the awareness and also interest, both from a policy level with the climate leadership plan and with the local business community, all very much in the last few years working to understand our emissions inventory as a community and work towards reductions. So just a really quick background, Synergy Enterprises is a carbon accounting company. We work with companies to measure and reduce their emissions and find sort of the best investments where you're going to get the most return in terms of carbon reductions per dollar spent. So that's really what we look at. We work with airports across Canada, marine ports. Marine ports, though, just from a carbon accounting perspective, is a newer territory than other types of ports. Airports, it's very common to have a carbon footprint report, be measuring and reporting that annually. In marine ports, it's very much voluntary and early adopter based. So appreciate the GVHA sort of joining sort of that leadership group of ports around the world and starting to voluntarily measure and report emissions. So just to give you a bit of background, our report is separated into two components, criteria air contaminants and the greenhouse gas emissions component. So as we know, with regards to criteria air contaminants, or CACs, the International Maritime Organization has been steadily increasing regulation on fuel and engine emissions in order to avoid unhealthy concentrations of pollutants in the air. So as you can see on the slide, between 2010 and 2018, total passenger arrivals have increased significantly, 45%, and at the same time, total air contaminants have decreased by 41%, and that is a direct direct impact of those regulations. And those regulations, there's more details on those specificities in our report in the methodology section, and all of the emission factors are there. So if you have more questions about how these were measured, we've made our methodology public in the final pages of the report. Okay, so criteria air contaminants. We're seeing also, of course, due to the increase in passenger counts, we're seeing the kilograms of CACs per passenger decrease from 0.84 to 0.34, so it's a 59% reduction as it relates to the increase in passenger counts. So the next component, of course, is the greenhouse gas emissions inventory. Greenhouse gas emissions have increased 19%, while passengers have increased 45%. The reason greenhouse gas emissions haven't increased 45% is that ships are getting larger, they're carrying more passengers per vessel, and ships are becoming more efficient in their engines. And again, that's due to regulation in when that engine was constructed. Transportation-related emissions are down 41% since 2010. So that's ground transportation. And cruise, of course, as you can see there, the 96% remains the largest contributor to the carbon footprint. So when we conducted our opportunity assessment for emissions reductions, that's what we focused on. So looking a bit deeper at that 96%, as you can see, the rest of the Ogden Point inventory is just over 3%, so that's all of the buildings and facilities and ground transportation. There's more details on that 3% in the report, and we did outline a few opportunities for the GVHA to take to reduce that wedge as well, but the majority of our report focused on that 96% associated with the ocean-going vessels, and within the ocean-going vessels component, 71% of the emissions are arising from hoteling of those vessels. So, what can we do about it? Where is the best way to get those emissions reductions over the long term? So, we look at opportunities and value them as dollars per ton of emissions that can be reduced. So we all have limited budgets when it comes to spending on climate reduction opportunities, so we want to get the biggest bang for a buck as quickly as possible to meet the carbon reduction targets of the IPCC and others. So we looked at this top opportunity, and of course what we found was shore power. So we already know that 45 or more ships in 2018 were shore power capable, so that was very encouraging. While we're seeing more ships in other regions of the world transitioning to LNG. Along the west coast, the trend is certainly electrification. In BC, we have a great asset in a very low carbon electricity grid. If we were building, looking at shore power in New Brunswick or Nova Scotia, it would be a different story entirely. Their carbon grid is 100 times more potent than ours is here in BC. So we see that as a really great asset. The proposed system from the study done in 2012 was a single interruptible power at Pier B. What that means is single means one plug-in location. Interruptible power means that BC Hydro could interrupt that power as they see it as, not a necessary power source. They could interrupt it if needed, if there was some kind of power emergency. If this was a hospital or something like that, that would be a different story, but they put interruptible power in places where technically there is another way to power this facility. Power interruptions don't tend to happen often, but it gives a lower rate for the electricity. Vancouver has seen very few of these, and they're also on interruptible power, but just a note on what that means. Max capacity of 12 megawatts to meet the demands of these larger vessels. So when we did the analysis, we looked at all of the ships that we see that came in 2018 and the ships that are registered to come in future years, and looked at what is the total potential emissions reductions of that. There's some estimates, of course, that are made, but we took a conservative approach, and we found that with even a single interruptible power station, GHG emissions could be reduced by half of all hoteling, which would result in 36% of all cruise-related emissions being reduced. With regards to CAC emissions reductions, we would see a 47% decrease in hoteling and 33% of all cruise. And again, these are conservative figures as we see more and more ships moving towards electrification, but perhaps that's not online yet and will come in future years. So we anticipate that these numbers are conservative and sort of a snapshot of if this system was to put in today, but as more ships transition to being shore power able, those numbers will increase. So down to the final price tag component, we expect that the cost would be closer to $15 million in today's market. When we measure that over a 30-year lifespan of the system, that would result in a cost of $100 per ton of emissions reduced, which is actually a very good investment when you're looking at BC and our market economy. Normally, when we look at emissions reductions as $1 per ton, we're seeing it in the sort of $300 to $1,000 range. So I wasn't expecting it to be this good of an investment when I did this analysis. So we were really pleased to see that this would be a good use of funds. When we looked at how Vancouver paid for their shore power system, we found that what they did is formed a relationship, the federal government with the cruise line industries and other local government partners, and they split the costs into thirds. We could share those details as well on how they funded that program. But Victoria does have a very ambitious climate leadership plan. What we hope to see is just meaningful reductions in carbon that are good use of funds wherever they come from. And I think that we have a great opportunity in Victoria to have a low carbon port and have something that we can really show off in the world. And there's mechanisms to get even further and become a zero carbon port with other economic mechanisms. So I hope that throughout this conversation, we can look at what are the true emissions reduction opportunities in our community. Thank you. I'll pass it on now to our next speaker.
Okay. Thank you, Mayor and Council, for having us. And I want to start by saying I'm glad we're having this conversation. I think it's healthy, I think it's positive, and I think it's a way in which we can continue to improve as an industry and as a group and work together and find ways that we can be sustainable and continue to be here for years to come. So my name's Stephen Aqua. I work for a company called Timac. We're an older company. We're started in 1929. We're a green marine facility, and we primarily specialize in marine transport. And over the years, as the need arose in Vancouver, we started specializing in waste. Everything from general cargo, so big bulk vessels, down to cruise ships. And the majority of what we do now on the waste handling and recycling side is related to cruise ships. We're a two-time recipient of the RCBC Award as the Recycling Council of British Columbia on excellence in leadership and environmental stewardship, and it's an award that's awarded and peer nominated throughout all of the other organizations that are part of RCBC across British Columbia. Now, I want to focus on two things today, and it's kind of the discussion of what's waste and what's recycling. A big part of what we do is work with the cruise lines and work with the teams on board on trying to reduce the impact that they have when they come into port. And a lot of that is, what can we divert? What can we take out of the traditional waste stream and recycle? So, especially when a new ship comes into port, a new brand comes into port, what we do is we put somebody on board that vessel to work with their teams and to make sure that they're able to follow local regulations and to know, because in some parts of the world, everything is put into the waste. They have pickers at the landfills that then go through and recycle. What we try to do is make sure that all the recycling is done on board prior to them coming into port. A, to speed up the process, and B, to make sure that what can be recycled is recycled. And later on in one of the slides, I do go through some of the things that we do manage from a recycling standpoint. A big part of what we do is diversion. So not only on the recycling side, but if there's things that we can provide for not-for-profit agencies that we can donate, we try and do that as well. So it's everything from furniture to exercise equipment to any kind of electronics on board, whatever it is that we can divert out of those streams as well that traditionally would go to waste, we try to recycle. And I know there's been a lot of discussion on waste to energy. Unfortunately, we don't have waste to energy in Victoria, but we're looking for other ways in which we can innovate. And working with the cruise lines and some of the meetings we had, we just came back from Florida, a lot of the newer vessels, they're looking at new technologies. And as things change, there are new things that are coming out that are going to help us with that. Everything from volume reduction, so dehydration of the traditional waste that they can't recycle, to try and reduce the amount of volume and the amount of weight of what's coming to shore, to shredders and numerous other products that they're trying to put on board. So that's when it comes to onboard reduction. And then also landfill-free initiatives where we can. Obviously, we want to make sure that nothing goes to landfill. From an auditing and certification process, because we have somebody that goes on board with the vessels, all of our processes are audited both by the cruise lines as well as by the different agencies that we report all of our information to, proving that we do say what we are going to do with the waste. So it's very cradle to grave, making sure that things are recycled. They're not just being sent somewhere with the hopes that they're going to get recycled. We make sure that everything is recycled, so we track all of our materials. From a diversion environmental result, some figures from 2018, we don't have 2019 yet, but 98% of what we took off provincially was diverted or recycled. So 85% of that was recycling itself by volume, and less than 2% of what we received did go to landfill. And some of that is just through the nature of the products, we couldn't do anything else with them. And we're hoping to change that. So one of our goals by 2030 is to make sure that we're 100% landfill free. A couple of the cruise lines that we worked with were able to achieve that last year. Royal Caribbean Celebrity were able to achieve that. And a lot of that comes down to our great environmental team working with their environmental teams on board and finding alternative ways that we can manage a lot of those waste streams. We did talk about future technology investment and implementation. We are also internal looking at things like waste to energy. Is it something that we can invest in as a private company and try and to take that on? So we're having that discussion now. Carbon neutrality, our goal was 2030, but it looks like by the end of next year, ourselves as an organization and operating on the terminal, we will be carbon neutral ourselves. And a lot of that comes down to the types of technologies that we can use. All of our equipment's less than 2 years old, and what we're looking at is electrification of our own equipment and other methods that we can do to make sure that our impact on managing a lot of these streams and transporting the streams is as neutral as possible. Now, when it comes to recycling product examples, here's a small list. So it's everything from batteries, broken china, crockery, cardboard. A new pilot program we put in place this year was recycling cigarette butts on board. Sending those off for reuse. Fridges, compressors, cooking oil, e-waste, food compost, and grease trap, turning those into actual feedstocks as well for livestock using products like that. Glass lights, mattresses and carpet, and so on and so forth. So what we try to do is really divert as much as possible. Now, I think some of the confusion around waste in Victoria, especially as of late, is that it's a new thing. We've been taking off waste ourselves for the last 2 years. One of our partner companies has been doing it since cruise ships started coming in. And I think where some of the discussion is coming from is the presence that we have now at the terminal. People are actually noticing because we have the same equipment. It's all branded up, and they're starting to notice it. And the idea behind us putting our facility at the terminal was trying to reduce the amount of traffic. We wanted to put everything single commodity and transport single commodity versus just moving containers and trucks full of all mixed goods that then went somewhere else for sorting. We don't do any sorting at the facility itself. It's literally just transferring from what we receive from the cruise lines into the appropriate commodity for final transport. And again, a lot of that comes down to, and I have to credit our teams for working well with the ships on board, making sure that everything is done prior to it coming into port. I'll pass it on now.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Mayor and Council. It's a pleasure for me to be here today. My name is Barry Penner. I'm a lawyer, and I'm representing Cruise Lines International Association, which represents 95% of the cruise industry globally, with offices in 15 different parts of the world, North and South America, Europe, Asia, and Australia. Just looking ahead to the screen in front of us, just picking up where we left off in the presentation about the effort to reduce waste on ships. It's an ongoing effort. It is in the cruise line's inherent economic self-interest to take as little extra waste on board to begin with as possible because of the space constraints and the cost of doing so. So the cruise lines have been at the leading edge in trying to reduce the amount of packaging and other unnecessary materials that go onto the ships, and then finding new ways to repurpose the products once they're no longer required on the ships. We've heard about some of the accomplishments in diversion and just the reduction. The amount of products consumed can be as little as 0.7 of a kilogram per person per day on a ship, compared to about 3 times that amount for a person while they're on shore, going about their regular day-to-day life. Waste that can't be recycled or reused, as we've heard, is often repurposed once it's back on shore. And those members of Council who have accepted our invitation to come for an environmental tour on one of the ships when it's been in port will have seen firsthand the efforts that take place on board in the sorting of the used goods and the efforts that are made to try and minimize the amount of waste that ends up going to landfill. In terms of emission reduction targets, last year, Cruise Lines International and their member lines committed to a 40% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 compared to 2008 baseline. They led the International Maritime Organization in that commitment, and that's in keeping really with the history that much of the innovation in the shipping sector generally has been led by the cruise industry. Even though the cruise industry represents only about 1% of global shipping, many of the innovations and technologies that are later adopted elsewhere have come first from the cruise sector. About $1 billion has been invested in the exhaust cleaning systems, and we know that clean fuels have dramatically reduced air emissions. The Ministry of Environment's air monitoring here in James Bay have confirmed that. Significant reductions over the last decade or so. The systems that are being built today are designed to meet ultra-low sulfur requirements. They remove 98 to 99% of sulfur. They reduce nitrous oxides and well over 50% of particulate matter. Catalytic filters can remove an additional 30% of particulate matter. And 70% of the ships have the capability of running on alternative or biofuels. As you see on the screen in front of us, there's 44% of the ships on order or currently under construction are now LNG capable. 2 such LNG cruise ships are now in service. They're performing very well, and it's not without, didn't happen without considerable effort. It does create an engineering challenge to design the fuel systems and the storage for LNG on ships, but the cruise industry has risen to that challenge with their partners in the shipyards And the early results, as I said, are encouraging, and there are now, I believe, a total of 26 new cruise ships LNG capable that are on the order books. Other innovative technologies that we hadn't heard about just even 5 or 10 years ago, as I mentioned, are the exhaust cleaning systems. And in terms of shoreside power, while there's only 16 out of 1,000 ports worldwide where that's currently capable, where the 1,000 ports where cruise ships call, quite a number of those are here on the West Coast. And reference has already been made to the port of LA, Long Beach, Seattle, and Vancouver, and up in Juneau are capable of shore power. And the cruise industry is continuing to examine that and is certainly interested in working with our partners at the GVHA and with BC Hydro to examine the feasibility here in Victoria. Just another slide on some of the technological advances and issues to deal with climate mitigation and reducing emissions. As we've already heard, so LNG itself has virtually zero sulfur emissions and almost a 95 to 100% reduction in particulate emissions. So there is great opportunity there, but we acknowledge that that's just one step towards a more sustainable future. Starting in 2021, there's a project underway with a partner company in Germany and a CLIA member line to develop fuel cell systems, and that will be tested in 2021 to determine the feasibility of fuel cells as providing a means of propulsion for large ocean-going vessels like a cruise ship. So the innovation continues to happen. Research and development is ongoing, and we acknowledge there's more that needs to be done. In terms of the existing fleet, an increasing number of ships, when they're going in for their regular refits to be modernized and improved, are looking at refitting to allow electrical shoreside power, and that's going to continue in the years ahead. More cruise lines are interested in that, even though there are still only 16 ports out of 1,000 where it's possible to plug in. That continues to be of interest for the cruise lines. So again, we recognize that there still is more work to be done, but we're certainly keen to participate, roll up our sleeves, and work with Ian, who's keen to take this control away from me.
Thank you. I'll just finish off with one last slide. So in terms of our next steps, we again extend an invitation to Mayor and Council to tour the facilities down to the Breakwater District at Ogden Point, and specifically an onboard ship tour. And this time we'll try and do it not on Thursdays when you meet. And obviously we're welcome to come back. We know that this is not just one presentation, but the dialogue will be ongoing. So I welcome the opportunity to come back and update Mayor and Council on the progress around the development of the business case for shore power and any other ad hoc requests that may come in from either Mayor, Council, or from staff to work on this. And obviously we do come back on a regular basis as you are one of our member agencies to report back on our activities. So again, thank you for the opportunity, and we look forward to an ongoing dialogue regarding this situation.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming this morning. What I'll ask now is, Ian, if you could choose 2 members of your team to free up their seats so we can have our colleagues at the JBNA join our colleagues from GVHA, and then we can have questions and discussion on all the information we've received this morning.
So we'll do kind of rock, paper, scissors.
You decide however you like.
Yeah, Mayor, welcome that opportunity. My only concern is that there may be questions that may come from Council that the 2 of us may not be able to answer, so I just need to recognize that.
Let's pull up a couple extra chairs from the front row. That way there's room for everyone at the table.
That would be great. So that would be great if we could do that.
We sure can.
Yeah.
Look, our staff are just right on top of it. There we go, because there's been lots of information presented this morning, and I want Council to have an opportunity to ask questions, to learn more. And really, there's no motions today. And this, it's meant to be more of a workshop. So I'll suspend our rules of order. People can make comments or ask questions. And again, I'll note that it's 5 after 10. We've had lots of information come in this morning, so we'll have a bit more time, maybe 45 minutes if that feels like enough time. So questions, comments, thoughts, again, an opportunity to learn more about the industry, its impacts, its innovations. And okay, we'll start with Councillor Isaac.
Thanks. Thanks for all of your presentations. My first question relates to the waste being removed from the vessels. For the last year, I've served as chair of the CRD's Parks and Environment Committee, and currently we're looking at having to expand our regional landfill with a long-range plan of essentially anticipating it will fill up. And so the discussion is essentially how much of Mount Work we want to mine as aggregate to free up airspace for landfilling. And so from the standpoint of protecting the environment, my view is we should be mining as little as possible. And there's a number of mountain bikers who've built an extensive trail network on that slope, and they'll be displaced further into the CRD parcel. And then all the impacts of methane and other, even if we capture some of it, there's obviously all the transportation impacts. So I guess just wondering, hearing about other countries that essentially for a time were the receiver of international waste and over time have chosen to introduce and strengthen regulations. I guess just wondering, like, why would your company want to stop at cruise ships? Or I guess the question is, what's an acceptable volume? Is it the existing number of vessels? Is it more vessels? Is it fewer vessels? Is it just cruise ships? Or why don't we start bringing in barges if it really is about the economics of recycling? And so I guess just that question, and particularly given the very limited impact of the sector on the community relative to some of the Alaskan ports and the home port in Seattle, just wondering why this very geographically confined community on the South Island has been chosen as the repository for the industry's solid waste.
So I'll start with the international waste side of it. Regulation-wise, we're very limited on what we can do with the waste when it's deemed international waste. So when the vessel's high risk, which means they have foreign meat and dairy on board, and CFI deems to be high risk, so at risk for agriculture, we're very limited on what we can do with it. When the vessel relieves low risk status, we can send for incineration, we can send for waste for energy, we can do a lot more with it. So the reason actually why we were in Florida a couple weeks ago is to work with the cruise lines, work with the provision departments, make sure that we get we assist them in getting their low risk as fast as possible, so we don't have to leave that waste here. None of that has to stay in Victoria. So we want to try and, again, reduce the impact, find other ways that we can manage it, and that's going to be probably through the means of waste to energy. And so, we could look at reducing the impact that we have on, CRD resources as well.
Gets a question to Mr. Robertson as the representative of the landowner. Just wondering, what's the rationale for entering into that lease, given all of the community impacts coming from the sector, and the expansion of that waste stream just seems to be yet another impact that's making the industry, to be frank, less viable and less sustainable, and sapping, I guess, political will to preserve the status quo. So just wondering why GVHA chose to enter into that risk, given all the other issues we have on the go with ground transportation, emissions. Why even open the door to us being the repository for the waste that's generated before the ships arrive here?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Councillor. So just a question of clarity. You're asking why around the GVHA's rationale for entering into a lease with TIMAC, is that correct?
Yeah, and I guess the provision, so rather than a more narrow, presumably if the ships were overflowing, offloading a tiny amount of waste so they can make it back to Seattle 6 hours later. So, but why essentially such an open-ended contract that appears to allow the entire contents of the vessels to be unloaded?
Okay, great. So I'll answer that in a couple of ways. First off, actually it's the cruise lines that enter into an agreement with TIMAC to offload their waste. And as Steve has mentioned, the facility that is at Ogden Point is a transfer station. And prior to entering into the lease, we did check with the city staff, and the use is permissible under the zoning. So we were confident that we were not going around any kind of bylaw that's in place. And then I think the other question is, quite honestly, I'm quite proud of the work we do here in Victoria, because, as Steve mentioned, the reason why it's done in Victoria is because in some other areas in Alaska and in Seattle, there's not the ability for the cruise lines to divert the amount of waste going to landfill in those particular cities or towns. And because of the ability that we have in British Columbia and in Canada to recycle that, I think it's part of our larger role, our global commitment, to not just look at Victoria and what's coming here, but what we can do to divert product going to landfill in other parts of our world. So I look at it as more on a holistic approach, but obviously, looking at, is it a permissible use? Yes, it is. And we're very proud of the work that TIMAC does, and proud of the fact that Victoria is looked upon as a way in which this product can be diverted from landfill.
Thank you. My second question, and last question, is relating to the GHGs and the potential costs of installing shore power. So I guess to justify a subsidy, presumably the potential funders would have to be convinced that it couldn't be funded internally, essentially from business profits. Is it possible to be transparent with the returns of the industry so that government can decide whether or not a subsidy would be supportable, or whether there's enough revenues being generated from the business activity to support that capital upgrade?
So again, I'll answer that question in a couple of ways. First of all, we've already had some preliminary conversation with the cruise line industry, and they have committed to supporting us financially in terms of whatever that looks like. Part of the work we're doing with an engineering consultant that we've just engaged is to help identify what is the business case, because we realize that in order to make a compelling case, whether it's to industry or whether it's to government, we do need to ensure that we've got a strong business case. So that is part of the plan that we're working on with the consultant. I'm not sure, has that answered your question?
Most of the way there.
Yeah.
I guess to squeeze one last one in. Around the regulations, I think we are going in the direction of regulation on both the solid waste side and the emissions, and I would favor the city going to the limits of its authority, the maximum, to fill gaps that have been created by other authorities. So I guess if that is the direction we're going, is there any insights in terms of what a collaborative process can look like to ensure those regulations work for the industry?
So a couple of thoughts on that from me. First of all, I believe there is work that can be done in terms of influencing Transport Canada around further introduction of regulations, and I think that's a conversation for another time. But I think there is work that can be done there. We work very closely with our partners in the Port of Seattle, and there are some opportunities that we've discussed with them that we believe we can partner on, given obviously different federal government situation, but I believe there's more that can be done. And I think that for us as an organization, it's around working collaboratively with everyone that touches our industry, whether it be the cruise line industry, whether it be TIMAC who manage our waste, and I also think we're working hard to try and have an ongoing collaborative conversation with the community. Yes, the James Bay community, but also the broader Victoria community. So this is not going to get anywhere without complete collaboration, and I think that's what we've tried to focus on, and I think we're showing good progress there, but again, more can be done.
Thank you. Other questions or comments? Yes, Councillor Alto.
Hi, thanks for coming, everyone. There was great presentations, both of them. I have a few, I think, sort of just checking on what I think I heard questions, and then a couple of larger ones. First, actually, to one of the JBNA folk. Did I hear you suggest that the existing scrubbers that are used by the ships generally meet the existing standards of emissions, or did I misunderstand that?
We're talking about sulfur dioxide here.
Yep.
So the scrubbers must, and the ships have scrubbers and burn.
Can you lean forward, because there are people who are watching who, yeah, there we go, thank you.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so ships with scrubbers burning high sulfur fuel must achieve equivalent sulfur dioxide emissions as if they were burning low sulfur fuel.
Right.
So in terms of sulfur dioxide, solely sulfur dioxide, yes,
Right.
the scrubbers achieve that.
Great, super. I just wanted to make sure I heard that right. And then I have a couple of questions for the folks from GVHA. So you referenced in your presentation that, or I think I saw that on Pier A they have a 600 amp shore power plug already, but that it was for a specific purpose. And so is there any availability for other use, or is it just only capable for that one specific purpose, the repair purpose?
The shore power that's currently on Pier A is solely for that purpose. It could power maybe 4 toaster ovens, and that's all that's required from that ship. But so no, that power source at this time could not power any other ship.
Anything else? Yeah. Okay, thanks very much for that. And just on the shore power issue, did I hear you as well suggest that you're relatively certain that there will be some aspect of additional shore power by the end of next year, by the end of 2020, or is that just the planning phase?
That would be just the planning phase. That our goal is to have the report back from our consultant by late spring, early summer. Mm-hmm. Those findings would be presented to our board, and then we would move forward at that time.
Okay. General question for you. You referenced that cruise lines are about, I think you said 1% of ocean shipping generally. Is that about right? Have you said that? I'm not sure this is the right question, Mayor Help, so you can stop me, but I'm just curious. In a very concise way, can you share any information about what regulations all those other non-cruise ships deal with around waste and emissions? In like 2 minutes or less?
Yeah, they're all members of or governed by the International Maritime Organization. Mm-hmm. Cruise lines are part of that as well. And so the new low sulfur content standard, which will be taking effect in just a couple of weeks, mm-hmm. Will apply to the entire shipping sector. And so different cruise lines, shipping lines are looking at different ways to achieve that. One is to purchase that fuel. It will likely be at a higher cost than what they've currently been paying. Others are also looking at adopting the technology that the cruise lines have been proving out, which is the use of the scrubber technology.
Thank you for
May
that.
I speak to that for a quick second? Because you
Absolutely.
use the word waste. A container, I don't care if it's a container carrying, products like containers or even an oil tanker. These are staffed by just a few people on that thing. Their waste creation is virtually nil. We're talking here with a cruise ship, and we're talking passengers. You have to add on a couple thousand numbers to some of those ships because of crew. So we're talking huge things, and a really, a luxurious resort. We're talking a resort versus, a container ship and what have you. It's got a small crew. They're not carrying the same kind of load. The power they need is, they're not running water slides. They're not running these kind of things that a huge resort is. These resorts are huge, and they're consuming a lot of power and a lot of waste creating a lot of waste because they're feeding and entertaining thousands of people, whereas a crew on a container ship is a handful. Thank you.
Yes, thanks for that. Just 2 other quick questions. On the alternative fuel, in your presentation and in your presentations and your materials, you noted that one of the 2030 goals was an achievement of alternative fuels, and I think in the majority of your ships. But what is that, what are the numbers? What are your goals? When you talk about, I think you said 44% of the new orders are LNG, but by 2030, tell me what you think the industry could be from an alternative fuel perspective, and realistically.
I don't have a crystal ball, and the planning is ongoing. The design time to put a ship into service is many years, from initial conception to securing financing, and then detailed design and construction takes years. But as of today, 44% of the ships on order are designed to be LNG capable. By next year, that could be a higher percentage. At the same time, though, research and development work is underway. Money's being spent to look at other technologies as a fuel source. It could be biofuels, but also looking at fuel cell technology as an option and utilizing hydrogen. that those are future technologies that are being explored, while at the same time, cruise lines are making significant investment decisions, $22 billion worth of committed funds at other technologies, such as LNG.
Thank you for that.
These things are all kind of happening in real time, in parallel. It's not standing still.
Yeah, thanks. My last question is actually on something that I don't think you touched on, at least not in your presentation, unless I misheard it. But there's been a lot of conversation about the possibility of Victoria becoming a home port at some point in the future, subject to a variety of different requirements by different governments. And I guess my question to you in general is, what effect, if any, what impact would that designation have on GVHA's ability to be a more, if possible, to be a more assertive manager of things like emissions and transportation and waste management, shore power, that sort of thing? Does that have any impact at all, or is that just something that the cruise lines would like for their own interests? Is that a tool for GVHA?
Certainly it is, Councillor. It's fair to say that over the last 10 years, Victoria, I think we took the approach that we were just happy to have the cruise ships arrive, and that we were worried that if we started to flex our muscle or to make certain demands or requests, that the cruise ships would go away. I think we've grown up and we've matured. While we enjoy a very, very positive relationship with the cruise lines, we also know the important role that Victoria plays as a strategic port in the Alaska itinerary. So yes, over the last 4 or 5 years, we have worked with the cruise lines to find ways to mitigate impact. I'll give one example, and that is the steps that we took around mandating engine age. That did not come with a lot of pushback and very, very engaged conversations with the cruise lines, because in order to do that, we had to bring in a fee that helped us with the offsetting the investment in new technology. So what that meant was that the cruise lines were having to pass on an increased fee to the passengers. I don't think we would have been able to, I don't think we would have tried to attempt that 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, but we were able to do that. And I think that's an example of where we've been able to work with the cruise lines, but take a very firm approach around this is what we need to do. And in order for a cruise to be sustainable in Victoria and to mitigate the impact upon the community and the broader environment, that's the steps we've had to take. So to answer your question, I think as we look at home porting, as we look at increased frequency, yes, there are steps we've taken, and there's more that we can do. There's no question about that.
May I address this question?
Yes.
Thank you. We are very, very concerned about the concept of home porting. We did looking into it, and when we have a slide, which we didn't bring today, which shows you the supplies and provisioning needed to home port. It is huge. We understand from listening to City Hall sessions, we have on this island a limited food supply, which means we may have to bring it all in, which means more trucks and reefer trucks coming to James Bay again. And even the alcohol consumed on these things is huge. I mean, these are huge amounts. They're huge floating resorts. And I think it's important to realize that the GVHA a few years ago proudly spoke twice of provisioning. Once a cruise ship had problems with vegetables, so they decided to provision. They brought everything in embargoed from the States in great big reefer trucks, and they came right through to load up the ship here. And we had just reefer truck after reefer truck sitting on Dallas Road, revving away all night because they had to keep the refrigeration going to load that ship. I don't think we got the food supply here, and so we're going to invent bigger problems. The second time that they provisioned a direct local product was ice cubes. I wasn't too impressed. I'm so very worried about that, about home porting. I think it's going to create a whole nightmare of new problems.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah,
Mayor Helps, may I just
go ahead.
Yeah, may I just jump in?
And just Councillor Alto did raise a flag that this was really not what we were discussing today, but since it's been raised, it will continue the discussion a little bit, but we would obviously like to have a lot more information to understand the benefits of.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to respond because I think there's potential of some misinformation being communicated. Number one, because if we were to become a home port, it doesn't necessarily mean that provisioning would happen here. There are ships that home port out of San Francisco, but choose to provision in other cities because of price. And just to clarify, the last item that is being provisioned right now, which we're very proud of, is local craft beer. So there is, I think, strong benefit to looking at some provisioning that can occur in Victoria.
Thank you, Councillor Alto.
Yeah, that was the end of my questions. Thank you, and I apologize for taking us down that other path. But I think there was actually a really important thing for me, listening to those answers and comments, and that is there's no doubt at all that there's a significant and substantive conversation yet to be had about the future of cruising in Victoria. And what I really appreciate about all of you being here today is that you've taken the time to provide really in-depth presentations, providing a variety of perspectives. And what I hope comes out of this is what all of you, I think, have referenced, and that is some sort of a mechanism, and whether the city can be a facilitator in that or not, I think is an important conversation for us, but some sort of a mechanism for these conversations to continue forward. In my mind, there is significant conversation to be had about the sustainability and future of cruise ships in general. The fact that they exist now in Victoria makes us part of that conversation. And I think if we have any responsibility at all in being part of this, is to be the facilitator of that future and what that might look like. So I appreciate all of you being here today, and I think that it's just the beginning of this. And I hope the city can have an instructive and positive role in ensuring that conversation continues.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes, Councillor Thornton-Joe, Councillor Loveday, Councillor Potts. Questions or comments are both in order.
Thank you. And some of my questions were already asked, but thank you for everyone for being here today. And I think we appreciate, or at least I appreciate hearing the work that's being done, but I think all of us would say the speed at which it's done and the feeling of urgency that things need to be done is something that's on our minds, and wanting to see some of the solutions coming forward sooner. I was interested in a little bit about the consultants' work and what is being proposed, because I think you're waiting for that report, but I think you did answer that question of what you're asking. Some of the questions that I didn't hear being asked, and one is just a question I want to also ask about transportation. One is, I think in one of the reports, and I can't remember where it was, it mentioned that the scrubbers are of great benefit, but there are times there hasn't been mentioned, or it was mentioned that sometimes the scrubbers are not working, and did I read that in one of the reports that they're not working all the time, and that's a concern? And I was wondering, was it the James Bay report, and can I get a response on why they might not work on some days or not turned on or something?
It was one of these, excuse me, it was in one of the supplementary reports, not part of the presentation, and it wasn't specific to Victoria. Okay. It was just noted that scrubber malfunctions do occur in a reference that was cited in one of the reports.
And did you find that this is like occasionally or fairly often?
Well, it was more in relation to the fact that the synergy study was based wholly on theoretical information, not on actual measurements at Ogden Point. So yes, recognizing that, then things could occur that would make those results not in line with what's actually happening. Malfunctions occur, whether in scrubbers or elsewhere. And that was really the reference to scrubber malfunctions. How often that occurs, I can't say.
Okay.
If I may, I'll just add to that. So scrubber technology has been around now, Barry, for what, 4 or 5 years? Yeah, and early on. No question, there was probably some teething pains with that. But what we do now, and what we have been doing for a while, is that when every ship that comes in, our team down at Ogden Point goes on and conducts a log. So we take note of scrubbers that are working and not working, and I am not aware of any situation in the last 2 or 3 years where there's been a situation that the scrubbers have not been working.
Okay, thank you. My second question, and maybe it's a synergy, I'm not quite sure who it might be. I think in the public in general tend to try to choose more environmentally friendly ways of, if they are traveling, of choosing their travel, whether it's the places they're staying, and I'm sure cruise lines. Is there work being done, or is there benefit work being done in more education or public education on which cruise lines? So putting the pressure on the cruise lines, because of course if people aren't booking those cruise lines because they're getting bad report cards, what kind of work is being done, and is that beneficial to start to put pressure on the industry?
It's a good question. I would maybe defer to Barry on this too, if you're aware of anything. But I do think that there's just more public awareness in general about where airlines are at, where a lot of large corporations are at, and the impact of one's personal travel. I mean, we run the Impact National Travel and Tourism Conference for which is basically Canada's only sustainable tourism conference here in Victoria every January. And we get stats all the time about consumer awareness and how much that is increasing and how buyer behavior is starting to influence these big brands. We see that as a very positive sort of grassroots momentum piece of the broader change in industry. There's a lot of different pressures on companies that are coming into force. So I don't know if this answers your question directly, but I do think there's more and more transparency. And it's not just specific to cruise. It's airlines, it's tour operating companies. You know, everyone is looking to report and be more transparent. And speaking of reports, I guess I should, since it's been mentioned a few times that this report is theoretical, I should mention a note on our methodology that maybe can speak to how this is in fact an empirical report. It's the same methodology that we have used as the city's own greenhouse gas inventory report, which is based on the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and ISO 14064-1, and all of the established mechanisms for this. And we even did some of our own research to determine. We went as detailed as what engine does this ship have. What engine did this ship have in 2010? It's very, very detailed, and you can see that in the report, which is why it took 9 months and not a weekend. If it was a theoretical report, I could, put some numbers in a spreadsheet. But this is quite a complex study, and it could have been, and other ports have, 300-page reports on the background data. And just to note that we're happy to share any more of that, but we wanted this to be very readable so that the public was able to have access to it and actually digest the information. Sorry, I'm kind of answering two pieces here at once, but I do think that more and more cruise lines are reporting on their plans for emissions reductions, and that's where some of the data that Barry mentioned is coming from.
May I comment quickly? I think I would urge you all to, on your favorite sites, to look into cruise law. Cruise law is run by Jim Walker in the United States. It is the best source for information on cruise ships anywhere that we have ever found. Cruise law has also worked, Jim Walker and Rox Klein, of course, from Newfoundland, have been involved in Senator Rockefeller's hearings that have been occurring over the last umpteen years in the United States dealing with cruise ships issues. And we have found, frankly, we get better kick, JBNA, out of getting tweets from them because they are one of the most looked at cruise related websites in the world. And we focus on them more than the local press, because that is where, indeed, that we find that the cruise industry, I'm sure they're all hooked into cruise law, because it's a very important thing, whereas the local, or not the local, but the Newfoundland website, which is run by Ross Klein, deals more with deaths and rapes and that kind of thing that occurs on cruise ships, whereas cruise law is broader and deals with more other things. So I urge you all to please look into that.
Thank you very much. Yes, go ahead, and then back.
Can I make just a quick comment as well?
Shh.
And,
yes, you can. And, sorry, hold on. You can, and then you can, and then I'm going to go back to Councillor Thornton-Joe. Again, this is not our only topic on our agenda today. I'll just, we want to make sure we have fulsome conversation, but yes, go ahead.
Just a quick one. There is a difference between using theoretical values for the city and theoretical values for the cruise ships. The main difference is actual values, taking actual measurements, what's possible, but was not done.
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry, go ahead, sir, and then back to Councillor
Yes, in response to the councillor's questions, the cruise lines are operating in a very competitive environment. There's lots of competition for tourism dollars, and we're aware that the public has a strong interest in environmental improvement. So the cruise lines do spend an enormous amount of time and energy surveying their own customers, what it is that they like to see, and it is driving the changes that you're seeing in the industry. But we operate in a very competitive environment. People have choices. They can stay home, they can go to land-based resorts, they can go camping, they can do all sorts of things. But despite that competitive environment, we're seeing that cruise remains a very popular choice for many families. Multi-generations are utilizing cruise as a way to have time with their grandparents and the grandchildren and the parents in between to experience things together and see parts of the world that they otherwise couldn't get to, such as the shore of Alaska.
Thank you, Councillor Thornton.
Thank you. And then my final question, and I think part of it is to GVHA, and the other second one to the James Bay Association. In transportation, you talk about ground transportation. You talk about the standards for example, buses and. Are you putting more requirements or of having more either electric vehicles or so that's my question to you, and then to Ms. Gardner. A topic that's been of interest at this table recently and quite often is the horse-drawn carriage industry, and in relation to you talking about ground transportation, if there's any comments about that in relation. I won't go further because I want to make this quick.
We were the first port in North America to experiment with fully electric, brand new double-decker buses. And 2 have been purchased, and there has been significant teething pains with both of those buses, but I understand Mr. David Roberts from Pacific Northwest Transportation Services was here speaking to Mayor and Council, I think last week, and commented on the fact that the good news is that one of them is up and running, and that his organization, we contract Pacific Northwest Transportation Services to operate our ground transportation as it relates to buses. And David and I have had significant conversations around not just looking at further electrification, but I believe looking at compressed natural gas, other ways in which we can not just for me, we've reached that 2010 engine level. Well, that's not the status quo. We're not just going to hold there. There's continued work and more work that can be done. And I'm very proud of the relationship that we have with Pacific Northwest Transportation Services and their commitment to find more energy efficient, fuel efficient, and environmentally efficient buses to engage.
And does that include also like taxis or any other cars that provide sightseeing?
Yes, most of the taxis. I don't have the number, but we're fortunate in Victoria that we do have a significant fleet of electric taxis, electric powered taxis. So I'm not sure how many of those operate on and off the terminal, but we obviously continue to support any innovation that industry can find.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Councillors.
I love the horses.
Sorry.
Sorry, I was answering her question.
Okay, yes.
Horses.
Yeah.
Years ago, we had a lot of complaints on horses, especially the excrement. We only had one complaint this year, and that was dealing with horse and human excrement on Beacon Hill Park. And the horse and carriages are a great calming influence in James Bay on the streets, and of great benefit there. Coming from a rural background, I really love to see the Clydes myself, but I do know that they are very valued, and they're very valued, especially, I find, not just tourists, but tourist visitors and what have you who have little kids. They get to see a horse and what have you.
Thank you. I just wanted that question when it came to land transportation.
Yeah, and they're
they're
also located. Their home port is on Menzies, which in a place where they do not directly impact the odors and what have you, direct residences, which is great.
Thank you. I've got Councillor Loveday and Councillor Potts. And for those people who aren't speaking, could you turn your microphones off? Because if we get too many mics on, we're going to start having weird noises happen. Okay, Councillor Loveday, go ahead.
Yeah, first like to thank you all for coming for this important discussion. I just have two questions. One, it was a comment by one of, I believe by the speaker from the JBNA regarding shore power in Vancouver and how some ships with the capability for shore power didn't end up using it, even though it's available there in Vancouver. And I'm wondering if anyone from the GVHA can comment on why that would be.
Councillor Loveday, I have no information on that as to why a ship would not be hooking up if it's available. Certainly that would be part of the process that our consultant will look at, is to understand reasons why and what could be done to encourage that to happen.
Yeah, anyone who has
go ahead.
Answer, please.
We did do some research to establish a percentage assumption when we did the analysis to get to the 51% emissions reduction. So we used 2 ports and averaged their hookup versus, so taking the number of ships that are shore power capable, what percentage of them are hooking up when they're at port. There's sometimes very different reasons we found as to why they may not. It could be that they're not in port long enough, or there's a logistical challenge, or for some reason they're doing maintenance on some part of their electrical system. There's a whole range of things, but in general, they were all around over 80% of the ships that were capable were hooking up. So we factored that into our assumption of the 51%.
There's one other reason which Jill mentioned.
Sorry, just wait. I'm chairing, so I have already said who's next. So go ahead, and then you can go after that. Yeah, go ahead. Okay, thank you.
Okay,
go ahead.
Jill mentioned something earlier, which I recalled, which was in 2012, whenever it was, when you were talking about interruptible and uninterruptible power. Even in Vancouver, sometimes different, because the harbor has various things on it, not just ships, there are actually, people are asked to go off, because even in Vancouver, they cannot always carry at the capacity from hydro. And again, that would relate back to the interruptible, uninterruptible, which we confirmed with our own contacts in BC Hydro too.
Great, thank you very much.
That is part of the reason.
Thank you. Councillor Loveday, go ahead.
Yeah, and this one, speaker from the JBNA also mentioned the studies they'd done on traffic and speeding is related to coming off the cruise ships, and traffic management and traffic calming are in the city's jurisdiction, and city has taken some steps in this regard, and perhaps more needs to be done in terms of engineering solutions. But also think that if this traffic is originating in the same place consistently, then there may be some onus on the GVHA as well. And so I'm wondering if you can comment on that. And I know you've had you've got the double-decker buses in these types of programs, but specifically, I guess, on the routing and speeding and other behaviors that could be negatively impacting the livability of James Bay, if you can comment on that.
Absolutely. So we do work with city engineering staff on the routing of the buses, and we collaborate with them on that. With regards to taxis, this is a common issue that both organizations agree on. That's a challenge, and I'll be very candid with you. As an organization, we've approached city staff to install speed signs on various roads, and I'm disappointed to result we haven't had much uptick from engineering staff on that. We are prepared to install speed GVHA is prepared to pay. I know in other areas of Victoria and Vic West, where you have those speed signs that tell how fast you're going, not going, we would welcome the opportunity to install one or two on certain streets. We also have ongoing conversations with the Victoria Police Department around speed traps, speed monitoring. They are a great partner, but I believe just their resources are stretched to be able to have a consistent presence out there. But there's no question that steps can be done. I think this is a common ground in which both JBNA and GVHA could work on to find ways to mitigate speeding taxis through the neighborhood. We accept that's an issue, and we're as frustrated about it as the neighborhood is.
May I?
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. By the way, I don't want the city to take all the flack for this because it's really not their responsibility, but there was a sign last year with the speed limits, so that has occurred, or what speed you're traveling. We have had those. But the taxi drivers now, they know which, if they don't have a passenger, who cares? But the real problem, I think, is that, and the police have very limited thing, because we all know that if it's fought in court, it costs so much in the way of police time, and that's not a solution. We need control, contractual control, which GVHA can do by giving access on there, and they can control who goes on their site, could bring into the GPS system. We really need that. We need control. We need prevention. We don't need, let's burden the police more.
Okay, thank you very much. Is that all, Councillor Loveday?
Yeah, just a closing comment is just that I'm really glad that we're having this conversation and that we're all in the room together here. I think the tourism industry is heading towards a climate reckoning, and we'll need to adapt very quickly. And I think it serves both our planet and our local tourism industry very well to do everything we can as quickly as possible to lower our carbon emissions and cut our waste. And so I'm very happy to be having this conversation, and hope we can make progress very quickly.
Thank you. I have Councillor Potts, Councillor Dubois, and then myself, and then after that we'll wrap up the discussion. And thank you all very much for coming. But Councillor Potts, over to you now.
Great. I'd like to also extend my welcome and thanks for everyone for being here and everyone in the audience who's here today. I think it's really positive to be at the same table to discuss our responsibility to climate action, and also our shared responsibility to make the best impact for the citizens of Victoria, also the employees of the cruise industry and the tourism industry in general. Benefit of going last is a lot of my questions have mostly been covered. I did want to ask for a point of clarification on it's page 11 of our document from the Bay Neighbourhood Association. Just from my understanding, I assume it's just going Ogden Point water lots. From what I understood, it was all federal land, and I'm just hoping for a little bit of. I assume the water was federal land, and I'm just. Did I understand that correctly, that it is not?
No. Ogden Point used to be federal. Sorry. Thank you, Lisa. Ogden Point used to be federal land. It is not. GVHA owns it outright, fee simple. And as an analogy, I'm going to give you the...
Federal land or the water?
Both.
The water, okay.
The water lot. I'm going to give you as an analogy is the Victoria International Marina, for example. They have more than one water lot there. They own a couple of them, but one they lease from the province. So you have different ownership on water lots in the city. And in this case, these belong to GVHA. It's part of the land and property transfer years ago.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. My next question is for TIMAC. I'm just wondering if you could help me just understand a bit about the potential fees, or if the recycling from that you collect from the cruise ship, is it subject to any of the fee structures that are put in place by BC Recycling?
No. So everything is they're. It's kind of twofold. We do two things. So from a recycling standpoint, we try and incentivize the crew to recycle. So there's particular commodities, some of the higher value commodities that we can actually rebate them back on. That goes right to the crew funds. to give them on-board incentives. So it could be stuff like cooking oil, various metals, aluminum cans, stuff like that. Nothing that comes off of the ships at all is they don't get anything back from the BC government. So normally, you return your cans and glass, they're not subject, they can't have any of that. And they have to pay for our transport of it and the recycling of it as well.
So the shipper is responsible for paying for the transport?
Yeah, they pay us for managing that side of it, and that includes either the recycling or the disposal of it.
And so then does your company then have to pay fees to?
Yes,
okay.
yeah, so it's a pass-on essentially.
A pass-on, okay, so it eventually does get covered?
Yeah, it gets covered by them.
Okay, thank you. I think that, I think those are my questions for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Dubois, go ahead.
And thanks to the presenters. Most of the questions I had has been covered, but out of curiosity, and it's great that we're having this discussion. My curiosity is, has the two groups, the James Bay Neighbourhood Association and the Greater Victoria Harbour Authority, have they said before, or this is the first time that such discussion is happening?
I think that these two groups have been discussing many things for many years.
If I may, Mayor.
Okay.
Councillor Dubois, thank you for the question. No, this is not the first time our two organizations have had face-to-face meetings. From GVHA's perspective, we work hard to try and meet minimum a couple of times a year, beginning of the season, end of the cruise season, to talk about issues and opportunities.
May I?
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. There was a great change in what started as collaboration, ended up not, and that was during the Gudgeon Affair, what I will refer to as the Gudgeon Affair, when Shelley Gudgeon was not allowed on the GVHA board and then was put on when the appointment process changed. At that time, it wasn't Ian, of course, one of his predecessors, did state to us that they went through a real review of their own governance and decided that they didn't have to communicate with us anymore and actually do real consultation as the democratic process wasn't imposed on them. And so there's been some discussions since then, but the collaboration ended really very much that day when we were told that they didn't have to actually consult with us. And I think that's sad.
Great, thank you. Councillor Dubois, you still have the floor.
Thank you, Mayor Helps. And the reason why I ask it is just as someone who's new to these discussions, is sometimes important to understand the background and what type of discussions have taken before, and it seems that this has been ongoing. As we received today the report, I'm also wondering, and each James Bay Neighbourhood Association and the Greater Victoria Harbour Authority, what are some things you're hoping the outcome would be? And I understand this is just to receive as a report, but what are some of your hopes? And I heard through the presentation, but if you could reinstate again. Thank you.
Thank you. Great. What are some of your hopes from both organizations in terms of collaboration going forward for the industry?
I'll go first. We know that there are many organizations and groups within the James Bay community, and I believe that there's an opportunity for us to communicate more broadly to the James Bay community, not just with the James Bay Neighbourhood Association, and that is our goal. It is my goal, and there's no secret that there's a lot that we disagree on, and I don't think it's really maybe on the what, it's the how, and we have different views on how we get there. But it is my hope that there could be perhaps one or two items that we could agree on, that we could work together on. For example, we've just talked about taxis. You know, that's something we both agree on, that work can be done. So I would like to think that we could pick one or two items that we could work together on. But for us as an organization, it's reaching beyond the James Bay Neighbourhood Association and having more frequent, ongoing dialogue with all of the other entities that are in that neighbourhood, and probably more specifically the business community.
Thank you. Ms. Gardner, go ahead.
I think this is really speaks almost to the root of part of the problem. It has been stated, this has been GVHA's policy for a long time, that they are for the benefit of the region. And if you dilute the problems by consulting people who are not impacted, you can dismiss anything. And that has been a major problem when we hear that. The James Bay Neighbourhood Association is accepted by the city as being the land use group for James Bay, and I think that is very important. And we have brought skill sets, and I hope you recognize that today, that bear on this subject, which is very different than asking someone from the senior center whether or not they think there's emissions issues. It's very different when you're dealing with a group that is actually looking at land use issues. The other thing, and I'm going to throw this out to Lisa as a challenge, to Mayor Helps, and that is what I found interesting, especially in TIMAC's discussion today, was we kept, a lot of us, mentioning the word Seattle. So we've had the mayor of Seattle who wanted the city to take care of our sewage because they thought it might impact them. Perhaps it's time that we ask Seattle, if Seattle really can't handle recyclables, wow, that says something about Seattle. So perhaps there's also a good role for mayor to mayor on telling Seattle to take care of their industry's wastes rather than have all these tons coming through James Bay. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Dubois, is that everything from you?
Thank you, Mayor. It helps, yes. And thanks to the presenters for coming in today.
Thank you very much. I've just got a few questions, and they're bigger global questions, and then I'll make some wrap-up comments that will hopefully wrap up the discussion. So first question, the notion of GPS on taxis as a condition of being able to access the Breakwater District. Is that something that you could consider? I mean, certainly we've put GPS on our fleets here and police fleets to understand emissions and also to understand maintenance. So is that something, I mean, it seems like a very practical solution that we would understand the speeds going through neighborhoods by GPS. Is that something that you could consider?
It is. Yeah, absolutely. Mayor Helps. We would look at any solution. I think it's a question of what do you do with that, because it's a complicated answer, because you could put a GPS on a particular taxi, but sometimes it could be the driver that's that's making the infraction. If there was a way in which and I could be wrong on this, but I believe there could be some privacy issues with if we were to collect that data, and then go back and maybe ask, the police department to issue a ticket because of speeding. I'm not sure if that could happen.
Yeah, no, I don't think, no, nor do I. I just to kind of get a sense, so we saw those bar graphs with very high speeds when there are lots of ships in port. If there's even sometimes just having a GPS changes behavior, right? If you know that there's, so anyway, I'll leave that. I think that's like a concrete, practical suggestion. I have a question about the study, and Synergy Enterprises is, I think, one of the nation's leading carbon calculating companies, and I'm proud to have Synergy here in Victoria. And so there was I did have a question about the theoretical versus actual, but then when you talked about that, you looked at the engine age in 2010, and so that's no longer a question for me. I appreciate you clarifying that. But there was a comment that the report assumes low sulfur fuel, and then I heard, I think the fellow from CLIA say that maybe it's because low sulfur fuel content will come into effect within a few weeks or a few months. So can you just talk about that assumption, and if that's the case, if that was the assumption, and if it's because of the new regulation that's coming into play?
Yes. So just to compare, to take the measure of emissions on every ship would be equivalent to putting a device measuring every city-owned vehicle, boiler, any piece of equipment that would generate, so that's why this is the global standard for carbon accounting, why the Greenhouse Gas Protocol was established, so that there is a common denominator. What I will say is it does assume that the vessels are meeting regulation. We have to assume that compliance is taking place. We did look at the links that were sent to us by James Bay, and they were visual monitoring, so there wasn't any data there that said these vessels were actually like we know for sure the scrubbers weren't working, so we couldn't verify that and include any of that kind of data in our report because it was just a visual monitoring which can be obstructed. So we have to go with what we know and what is empirical and what is best practice and the most recent emissions factors. So with reference to the fuel, what it comes down to is that the ships have to meet the equivalent in their emissions through scrubbers or through fuel type and sulfur content of, in 2010, 2.7%, in 2014, 1%, and then in 2018, 0.1%. So I really commend the IMO for making these stringent standards and pushing the industry forward to reduce sulfur, and that's at that international levels where we have some serious positive impacts on those. And then with regards to the NOx, it's all about the tiers of engines for the ships. So that depends on when the ship was built. So the more newer vessels that we have coming into port, which there are more and more of, the lower the NOx emissions.
Great.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that really
Probably
does.
in too much detail.
Thank you very much. Okay.
Excuse me, can I just add a little bit there? I don't know if your question was entirely answered because the question was, did the report assume low sulfur fuel? And I believe it did assume low sulfur fuel.
As the report states, it assumes compliance with what the regulations are, and the regulations are lower sulfur fuels.
Okay, thank you very much. That's fine, thanks. I don't want to get into the debate about lower salt. I thank you, and we can all read the report and interpret it how we will. Okay, kind of bigger, more global questions now. So we've seen in the presentation from the GVHA the increase in passengers and increase in ships, and certainly there are many benefits to the economy from that. And I think Councillor Loveday put it really well, and I don't know that anyone in this room would disagree that tourism is heading towards a climate reckoning, and that's not just true here, that's true around the world. And as Ms. Doucette pointed out, we have leading Becoming International Conference, the Impact Sustainable Tourism Conference, hosted here every January. So we're this destination and this city are leading that conversation. So there's no getting away from the fact that reckoning is happening, and we're all in the midst of it here together. So my next three questions relate to that. Has the GVHA looked at kind of a carrying capacity for the destination, and is that part of what you plan to do? What is the right number of ships? What's the right number of ships in at the same time? So it's great to see coming out of the Synergy report that the shore power conversation is happening, and that you're going to have a consultant, you're going to get a business case, and I'll clarify my comments on taxpayer subsidy at the end. So that's great. So what about carrying capacity for the destination? What about right number of ships? What about all of those things? Is that something that you're going to commence, that those kinds of questions, a study around that? Including the right number of ships at the same time.
Yeah, we've already begun that process. So through just capacity, we are limited to 3 berths. And so we do not see any increase in adding any more berths. What we are working hard to do is to try and spread out the additional cruise visits through days where there are no ships in. And we're seeing that in 2020. As we look ahead to the industry, and we're watching it very closely, while Seattle has talked about and they're planning adding a second berth, we may see some softening in the Alaska market over the next 3 or 4 years. That said, we are also working on what we call a 4th berth strategy, and that is to say, if the industry continues to grow, if the popularity in Alaska continues to grow, where could we accommodate another berth in the South Island? No question, it can't be out at James Bay. So I think we've recognized that there's no space there, and even if there was, we would have to find a way to try and disperse the passengers throughout the region. We work very closely with Destination Greater Victoria, and I know this is a very important part for that organization around what we'll call the carrying capacity of the city. So I think for us, it's working with that entity to figure it out together, because I don't think us doing it in isolation serves anyone. We know that we're about anywhere between 15 and 20% of the total sort of tourist visitation. So I think it's looking at not just the impact that cruise has, but the impact that all the visitors have. Where are they going? And together working on ways in which we can manage the tourist resident interface.
Okay, thank you very much.
May I?
Yes, go ahead.
I think it's important to know that we've been hearing about fourth berth outside of Ogden for many, many years. And if you look at that chart, that one of our charts, which isn't on the slide now, I know, where you could see the growth and how the time of day and that one, the limit will be when they fill it up. And it's filling up. They went from 2 or 3 days to the others. So if you look at that, you can see the potential, the maximum growth. I
didn't ask about maximum growth. I asked, is there going to be a study to look at the carrying capacity?
No, that was addressed by one of Ian's predecessors years ago, who gave a presentation at the Union Club. And someone in the audience asked, when will capacity be reached? He said, and the answer was, when someone says no.
Thank you very much. My second question, kind of at a big level, and it's for the cruise industry representative, and then I'll ask the same question to Ian. The city's climate leadership plan is something that we're very proud of and holding steadfast to. It's very difficult to reduce emissions. We know that from the day-to-day operations here. We know that from working with the community where 99% of the emissions come from. So it's hard work. But we've committed in our climate leadership plan to being 100% renewable by 2050. And is that a target that the cruise industry is aiming towards or thinking about, so that in 2050, imagining that there'll still be cruise ships coming into Victoria, are you aiming towards being 100% renewable by that point?
That's a goal that the industry would like to optimize, like to achieve, but the near-term target is a 40% reduction by 2030. That is the commitment that's been made. Achieving that goal is also a challenge. Going to zero is, as we all know, an even bigger challenge, but I think that's everyone's ultimate objective. But how we get there remains to be seen. As I indicated, one of the initiatives underway now is exploring the possibility of fuel cells. Whether that will prove to be viable remains to be seen, but a significant effort is being made in a variety of and a variety of areas, and we're using a variety of technologies to try and achieve a sustainable future.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah, and I thought the fuel cell research sounds very, very exciting and potentially promising. Ian, Mr. Robertson, from your perspective, what are can the GVHA commit to the same climate targets that the city is committed to in the climate leadership plan in terms of your operations here? Not that you have control of what happens on the high seas.
So I believe there are many steps that we can take in areas that we can control to be very close to meeting the standards laid out by the city. The piece, and just to piggyback on what Barry has said, I think that the cruise lines are trying to get to that point. So we as an organization will have limited impact upon that. But I believe there are many steps that we as an organization can take within our own operations to meet the city's target.
Thank you very much. So I'll just make a few wrap-up comments. I'm very grateful for this opportunity to hear from everybody. And for me, again, I'm just going to return to Councillor Loveday's wisdom that we are at a place of reckoning, not just with tourism, but with everything. This is the biggest challenge facing us as a species, and the next decade is the most important decade in human history in terms of whether we're going to stay within the 1.5 target or not, at the same time as having good jobs, at the same time as having prosperity. They're not incommensurate. One of the things that I think is going to really lead us well from here, it's a Buddhist principle, but interestingly it involves an ocean metaphor, so I'm going to share share it. It's this notion of going to the other shore, which means really walking over to the other side and understanding each other's points of view. It means being able to hold very complex things that are almost paradoxical in one space with one mind. And that is really how we are going to not only answer and ask questions, or ask and answer questions about what's the carrying capacity of cruise in the region and the city, but how do we grapple with being a sustainable tourism destination? How do we showcase our climate leadership goals? These are complex questions. And what I know for certain is that we have to be able to hold complexity. We have to be able to hold paradox. We have to be able to say we want good jobs. We want sustainable tourism. We want cruise. We want all of the things that make Victoria, Victoria, but it absolutely has to be done in a way that is going to protect the planet and the lands and waters, because the kids that are striking out there and others, they expect that of all of us adults, and we owe it to them. So I think we can do this, but it's going to take going to the other shore. It's going to take deeply understanding each other's points of view, and that's what I hope that we can do as a city and as a community. So with that, I'll wrap up this section of the agenda and really thank everyone for their comments and questions and generosity this morning.
Thank you.